Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Newfoundland's Gros National Park, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Anthony Mallinson. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Anthony, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rob, for that great introduction. And hello and welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here. It's really great to continue our week of presentations on national parks during National Park Week in the States. So I'm really excited to bring you guys a park from Canada. So like Rob mentioned, we're going to be talking about Gros National Park, which is in the easternmost province in Canada and Newfoundland. It's a beautiful spot. It's a rugged place, and it's got some really, really beautiful spots that I'm really excited to share with you guys. So I just want to start off today. We're going to do a really quick brief introduction about myself. Maybe some of you guys have traveled on trips with me up in Churchill or in Quebec. Maybe you don't know me at all. So we'll do a really quick introduction. Then we're going to start talking about the history of the park, some of the founding of the park, some of the wildlife and the ecosystems that we can find within Gros Morne. And then we're going to take a look at some of those wonders of the park. So like I mentioned, there's some really, really stunning parts of the park, and we're going to look at a little bit more detail of some of those parts. And then we're going to talk about some of the conservation efforts and maybe what the future of Gros Morne might look like. And we're going to keep the presentation pretty high level. Like I said, there's some really amazing detailed parts of the park, some amazing geology that we could dive into, but we'll keep it pretty accessible for everyone. And we really only have about an hour together, like Rob said. So we will leave some time at the end for questions. Before we begin our presentation today, though, I always want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional keepers of the land where I'm speaking from, which is an area called Roslyn, British Columbia right now. And that's the traditional territory of the Tectonics people. And Roslyn's really a beautiful place to live. And I'm happy to live here and get to continue to learn and grow with the original keepers of the land. And when we visit Newfoundland and Labrador later this summer with NatHab, we'll be traveling through the traditional lands of many different First Nations. The area around Gros Morne National Park in particular is the traditional territory of the Beothuk people. And they've kept Gros Morne that nice, wild and rugged and ancient and free place. And we really owe it to them that we have the opportunity to explore together and learn together in the park. So like I said, we'll do a really quick introduction about myself. I was born in a small town called Vancouver in the Pacific Northwest. I still spend a lot of my time on the West Coast there doing grizzly bear viewing and spirit bear viewing. But right now I live in a small town called Roslyn. So for our friends from the United States, that's about 2 hours north of Spokane, Washington. So it's that southeastern part of British Columbia. It's a nice small little mountain town. And for our skiing friends, it's right near Red Mountain Ski Resort. So I live there with my lovely wife and our little kitty cat Maui and our puppy Denver. And I've been working with NatHab for about 4 years now. So I work up, like I mentioned, in Churchill, where we do our Northern Lights programs and our polar bear programs. And I'm really excited to be leading these new trips in Newfoundland and Labrador starting this year. I have a background in environmental science and geology, which I took out in Nova Scotia. So also out on the eastern part of Canada. And it gave us a great opportunity to get to explore Newfoundland, get to explore the park, and also get up into Labrador, which is just an incredible spot up there. So these are just some images holding a beautiful caribou rack up there in the Arctic and then guiding some trips on the West Coast. It tends to get a little bit wet out there. So I mentioned when we travel through Newfoundland, we'll be traveling through many different traditional territories and up into Labrador of many different First Nations peoples. And the Indigenous history of Newfoundland really could take up several webinars. And it's also not distinctly my story to share, but it would really be a disservice not to mention the original habitats of the land while we talk about the park. So the human history begins at least 9,000 years ago on the Labrador coast. That's actually at a site that we get to visit with NatHab called L'Anse-le-Mort. And then we also have a site near Gros Morne National Park itself called Port aux Choix. And at Port aux Choix, we have human history dating back about 4,500 years ago. And both these sites are connected to a culture that we know of as the Maritime Archaic culture. This is a really marine-oriented culture. The technology was marine-based. The economy, the spiritual culture of the people was really connected to that marine ecosystem. And we know that these people, we don't really know too much about them, but we know they were displaced by predecessors to the modern-day Inuit. So we can think of the pre-Dorset and Dorset people moving in from the northern parts of Labrador. And then we can also think of First Nations moving in from the St. Lawrence area. Making their way out east. So the Micmac and the Innu people who are now inhabiting Labrador. So some of these First Nations would have moved down onto Newfoundland itself. and become the Beothuk people. And these people were also known as the Red First Nations, as during first contact with a lot of the early Europeans, the first contact, the Beothuk people would typically paint themselves with red ochre, and they became known as the Red First Nations. They were also probably one of the first peoples in North America to be really pushed to the brink of almost extinction, as these French and English settlers began to settle more and more along the coast of Newfoundland and push the Beothuk from their traditional marine gathering grounds where they were harvesting marine mammals and more into the interior of the island where there wasn't the resources to sustain the people. And it's thought there are very few Beothuk people alive today. So like I mentioned, this history is a lot more complex than we have time to get into today. So we'll start talking about the park, but just know that as we travel across Newfoundland, if you come join us, we'll be talking a lot about that history as we go. So before we really start talking about Gros Morne National Park itself, let's talk about that name first, because it is quite a unique name. It sounds quite unique, at least, but there's actually quite a few Gros Mornes throughout the world, and there's actually quite a few Gros Mornes throughout Canada. There's actually one in Quebec, and there might even be another one in Newfoundland as well. So there's quite a number of them. Its literal translation means big mountain standing alone. And that's a good image of it there. It's the mountain at the heart of the park. So it's Gros Morne Mountain as well. In reality, though, this name is really a reminder that the French were fishing on these shores until about 1904. So gros is the French word that means big, and morne is a Creole word that means rounded mountains standing apart from other hills. Gros Morne happens to also be only a handful of meters shorter than the high point of the entire island. And that long range mountains, and we'll see a map in a moment, is really quite a high range of mountains. It attracts a lot of clouds, and it's typically very wet and foggy in the area. So morne can also mean gloomy or dismal, and it can kind of feel really appropriate when clouds are raking across the mountain, or when you're standing in Trout River and it's just full fog and you can't see more than 10 feet ahead of you, which is quite a lot of the time up on the coast of the Northern Peninsula there. So first off, welcome to our listeners from around the world. I know a lot of us are coming from the States, but hopefully we have some listeners from around the rest of the world as well. So welcome to Canada. It feels so weird to say, but there's about 40 million of us Canadians now. Growing up, there's barely over 30 million of us, so it's changed quite a lot. We're really clustered only in a couple areas, really close to the American border. So around the Vancouver area and then around that Toronto, Ottawa area. If you've traveled to Canada with NatHab, I just took the time to put a few images there to see where some of our trips go. So on the West Coast in British Columbia, we do our Spirit Bear trips and Haida Gwaii trips. In between BC and Alberta there, that's the Canadian Rockies. So we have that wonderful train trip that we run up from BC into Alberta there. And then if you've had the chance to get up into Hudson Bay and the wonderful town of Churchill is where we do our Polar Bear, our Northern Lights, and our Beluga trips. And then we also have, there it goes, showing up that our new trips that we're running out. You can see where Gros Morne is located in the far eastern part of the country is where Newfoundland and Labrador is. Labrador is that mainland part of the province, and Newfoundland is the island part of the province. And it was the last province to be added to the country of Canada. So last year we celebrated 75 years since Newfoundland and Labrador joined Canada in 1949. So we'll zoom in a little bit more. We'll zoom in on Labrador, we'll zoom in on Newfoundland, and we're going to leave Labrador. It's up on the mainland there. And our trip, if you do come with NatHab, we do get a chance to go up to Labrador. It's a really wild place. It's really beautiful. But we'll just focus on the island of Newfoundland, and then we'll focus on Gros Morne itself. So Gros Morne sits on that great northern peninsula. You can see that great chunk of land sitting off the northern part of Newfoundland. And while the park itself, Gros Morne, is actually further south in latitude than London, England, we have a Labrador current that flows down from the Arctic. It brings down a lot of cold water, and it significantly alters the climate, and it leaves a lot of Newfoundland and Labrador as this subarctic and even Arctic climate in some parts. And we'll talk more about the wildlife, but that great northern peninsula, we can even find some of the southernmost populations of Arctic hare and Arctic fox and other subarctic and Arctic animals. So we'll look at that image on the right-hand side now. We can look a little bit closer at the park. We can see Bond Bay. Unfortunately, it's not labeled, but it's that big inlet there with those two bodies of water just right below Rocky Harbor, which is labeled. And we can see a number of those communities. So Trout River is labeled, Rocky Harbor is labeled. There's actually 7 local communities or 7 enclave communities within the park. So we have Cowhead, we have St. Paul's, we have Sally's Cove, Woody Point, some really, really beautiful names some great communities in there. And there's also about 170 kilometers of shoreline within the park. And we'll talk more about that marine ecosystem. The park technically ends at the tide line, so it doesn't protect that marine ecosystem, but the protection of those terrestrial ecosystems really benefits that marine ecosystem. The park itself is about 1,800 square kilometers, or about 700 square miles, making it the second largest park in Eastern Canada. At the time, it was the largest park, but now there's a park in Northern Labrador called Torngat National Park, which is a little bit bigger. Just for a little bit of a size comparison, that's about the size of the state of Delaware. So we're dealing with a really, really massive amount of wilderness, a really beautiful amount of wilderness that we get to go and explore. So the park was established in 1973. It was actually established as what we call in Canada as a National Park Reserve. And a National Park Reserve is really an area that's classified as a geographic area that's really subject to a claim in respect of Aboriginal rights with respect to renewable resource harvesting and things like that. So the park was made officially a park in 2005, but it's really quite a special park as some of those harvesting activities have been grandfathered into the park, and there's still opportunities for some of the local communities to retain some of those traditional ways of life like wood cutting, and we'll talk more about how the park has really worked with those local communities. So we just finished celebrating that 50th anniversary of the park, and like I mentioned, it's always been this special park where there's been special agreements with those local communities, with those 7 communities that have allowed these community members to retain their traditional ways of life, harvesting animals, fishing, logging, and also starting to transition to this more tourism-based economy, which can be a little bit more of a stable economy, especially for that area. The images here, we see some of the signage, and we also see this really beautiful new greeting facility that they put up. So this a new facility meets the viewscape and historical interpretation requirements of UNESCO site, because this is also a UNESCO site, and we'll talk about some of that history in a moment. So a little bit more history of the area. This is Trout River, one of those communities in the southern part of the park. Really, really, really beautiful spot. And we actually get to go spend the afternoon there on our NatHab trip. And the European history of the area is actually ironically quite limited. And I say ironically because this is actually one of the areas of first contact with Europeans. So we can go all the way back to the Norse first contact in year 1000, or we can be talking about latter European contact in the early 1500s and late 1400s. And a lot of it was happening around this area. There was whaling and there was fishing, but we didn't actually see a lot of permanent human settlement along the coast. That didn't really start happening until about the 1800s, early 1900s. In 1835, there's only 35 people living in what we now know of as Gros Morne National Park. And the main industry has always revolved around fishing. So wood cutting, trapping, and hunting being prominent as well, but really it's been the coast that have really drawn people to this area. With the establishment of the park in 1973, there was really this big concern that there'd be a lot of restrictions on hunting and wood cutting, and that could really upset some of their traditional lifestyles. But today, the park is really appreciated as being that major aspect of the area's economy, especially with the collapse of the fishery in recent years, just due to overfishing, the cod fishery collapse. More people in the area are becoming entrepreneurs with respect to setting up Airbnbs or setting up bread and breakfast and craft stores and different tourism opportunities or convenience stores and things like that. Many people think that tourism's really only been in the area since the park though, but there's actually evidence for tourism all the way back starting in the 1700s when some of those early British warships would stop in Bombay, or in the 1850s when sportsmen would start coming up to fish and hunt on some of those really beautiful freshwater lakes. And in the 1860s, we get adventurers and naturalists visiting the areas. And actually in the 1950s is when we get this first discussion of putting a park in the area. So it's been this rocky economic past in a lot of these areas that are resource-based economies. We often get this boom bust, this rocky economic past, and it's thought that tourism was going to be a much more stable resource for people. And that's really turned out to be true. It's really offered folks in the area this opportunity to transition from those traditional economies to that more stable economy of tourism, and it's really been a big benefit for the area. So I mentioned as well, Gros Morne has the distinction of being a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization. And I will quote here, they say the park provides a rare example of the process of continental drift, where deep ocean crust and the rocks of the Earth's mantle lie exposed. Within a relatively small area are classic textbook examples of monumental earth building and modifying forces that are unique in terms of their clarity, expression, and ease of access, end quote. So I know there's a lot of information in the site, or sorry, on this slide, but I just want to make the point that it's not just one or two really, really special sites within Gros Morne. There's a huge amount of really unique glaciology within the park. So these include areas like the Tablelands, where we can actually walk and we can see and we can walk on that exposed mantle material of the earth itself. So it's some of the most accessible in the world. Or the fjords of Western Brook Pond that we can see on the map there, and we'll dive into a little bit later. Where these massive fjords have been carved through rock that's more than 1 billion years old. There's also examples of ancient continental crust. There's continental shelf with abundant fossils. There's a cross section of that oceanic lithosphere, which includes that mantle material. So there's just this really, really rich area. And if you're interested in geology, I encourage you to read more. Like I said, we will keep it a little bit higher level today. We won't dive into some of this technical geology, but if you get a chance to visit with us or to visit on your own, just know that you're in one of the most amazing geologic hotspots on the earth. And it's just this incredibly accessible area. So a really, really special spot that we get to go visit. So while Gros Morne might really be known for its geology and for how accessible that is and how unique it is this vast area. It's home to numerous boreal and subarctic species as well. So notably, like I mentioned, Gros Morne and that northern peninsula in particular have some of the southernmost populations of Arctic hare. We can see that fluffy guy in the middle, as well as Arctic fox. But although recently red fox seems to be displacing Arctic fox quite rapidly, and there's some really great webinars by my colleagues through NatHub. They've done some talks on that subject as well. But due to its isolation from the rest of the North American mainland, the island of Newfoundland is actually home to only about 14 native mammals and really no large predators. We have black bears and we have some cats as well, but no large predators. No native amphibians and no native reptiles, but many non-native species have started to be introduced to the island, and that's had some serious impacts on a lot of the native species. Two of the most iconic animals in the park, I'd say, quite iconic for different reasons. So we can see the caribou there on the bottom of the screen. The woodland caribou, absolutely beautiful animals. The first place I saw caribou was just outside Gros Morne National Park, and we pulled over on the side of the road and spent a good amount of time with this really, really beautiful herd. So really unique. The males, the females, they grow antlers. We won't get into the life history of caribou. There's some great webinars online about caribou as well. But just know that they're amazing animals, and near Port au Choix we'll hopefully have the opportunity to encounter some of these animals as well. One of the other kind of main iconic animals, and an animal that's really associated with the park now, is moose. And moose were introduced to Newfoundland. They're not a native species there over a century ago, about 100 to 200 years. With no native predators and with a lot of abundance of vegetation, their numbers in the park and in the island grew really, really quite rapidly. And in the park, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more as well, they peaked in the late 1990s at about 7,800 animals. So some of you, I can tell, are already doing the math. We said the park's 1,800 square kilometers. So you can imagine how many moose per kilometer there were in the park. So they've obviously had a very significant impact on the growth of the forest within the park. And we'll dive into some of the moose management strategies that Parks Canada is using in just a moment. There's also black bear in the park. They're pretty rarely seen. We get a lot of small rodents like squirrels and chipmunks and other animals like beaver. There's lynx seen as well, but quite rare to see some of these animals in that boreal forest environment, but they are out there. So I already mentioned there's about 170 kilometers of coastline in the park. And technically it's not within the park. The park only extends to that tide line, but everything is so closely linked together, right? So that park is providing that protection to that marine ecosystem just by providing the protection to some of these terrestrial ecosystems as well. And there's a really high diversity of Arctic and temperate species within that Bond Bay and within the coastline itself. And almost all of the plant and animal species, all the marine plant and animal species that are found along the shores of Eastern Canada can actually be seen in Bond Bay at various depths. If we're talking about marine mammals, the most common marine mammals we would see would be the minke whale, which is pictured there. We often see them feeding at the surface. They're quite a fast baleen whale, one of the smallest baleen whales we have. And then we have the harbor seal there, quite a common seal that we get across a lot of North America. We can obviously get humpback whale, orca whale, different marine mammals coming into the area as well. There's a really rich marine environment connected to that St. Lawrence system as well. We get harbor porpoise, we get white-sided dolphins, so a huge variety of marine wildlife. And you can see the Bond Tours boat there. So there's opportunities to do whale watching and marine-based tourism as well. The Memorial University of Newfoundland also runs that Bond Bay Aquarium and Research Station. You can see that building there. And you can go in there, you can see what's living at depths. You can see some of those intertidal creatures, and you can start to explore some of that really, really rich marine ecosystem that's present along the shores of Gros Morne. So we'll look at some of the ecosystems within the park. And since it is such a large, vast area, it represents a number of different ecosystems. So we'll start at the top there. That's that alpine Arctic ecosystem. And it is generally restricted to the higher elevations in the park, where those extremes of climate really restrict tree growth, and they allow that barren ground kind of Arctic alpine tundra feeling. This barren area covers about 35% of the park, and it supports some of those animals we were talking about, those southerly breeding populations of Arctic and alpine wildlife and plants, like Arctic hare, rock ptarmigan, willow ptarmigan, some other species like that. The forest ecosystem is going to be the most extensive within Gros Morne. So this is the boreal forest ecosystem. It occupies about 44% of the park. It's quite wet in Gros Morne. We talked about that impact of clouds coming off the ocean and stacking up against the long-range mountains. So this includes a lot of productive coniferous and mixed forests as well in the lowlands, and some of the highlands being more coniferous-based forest. Balsam fir is really the dominant tree in Gros Morne, and we get a lot of spruce as well, and some really, really beautiful boreal forest formations. Like I mentioned, the forest in the park is under threat primarily due to colonization by non-native species, and primarily the moose. So we'll talk about that over browsing by moose and how it's led to really a massive disruption within the forest. The next ecosystem we have that is really represented, about 19% of the park is represented by this freshwater ecosystem. So there's several large, low nutrient lakes. We've seen a number of maps now where we can see those large lakes that were carved out by glaciers, low nutrient lakes, and large rivers like the Lamond River that we see pictured there, as well as a lot of smaller lakes, ponds, rivers, wetlands, bogs, like I mentioned, beaver ponds and things like that support a huge amount of diversity within the park. And then finally, we have that marine system there. We have that marine ecosystem that we've already talked about it a little bit in detail, how technically the park isn't really including that marine system, but how it's all connected, and how the park itself is really benefiting that entire marine system and how rich it is. And we get that really great example of almost all the life in Eastern Canada represented right in Gros Morne. All right, so we've had a chance to look a little bit about the park, the founding of the park, some of the wildlife we could see there, some of the history and some of the ecosystems that we can find. Now let's take a second, and we don't have too much time together, but let's take a second, let's look at some of the wonders of the park. And this in particular is one of the wonders of the park. And pardon my language, this is Pissing Mare Falls. It's one of the highest free-falling waterfalls in Eastern North America. So that drop, there's a 900-foot single drop and about 1,200 feet total drop of the waterfall. And we can actually see this right from Western Brook Pond. So this is Western Brook Pond, an absolutely stunning part of the park, probably one of the main attractions. It might be tricky to see on your screen there. You can actually take a boat tour. So that image there is from Bond Tours. Bond Tours is that main tour operator. You take a nice little stroll along a boardwalk, and from there you can get on the boat. You go all the way to the end of the pond, the lake, and there's absolutely stunning scenery. So it's surrounded by these 2,000 foot high, 600 meter foot high cliffs. And I mentioned earlier, these cliffs are part of this really, really old rock. It's about 1.25 billion years old, and it's been carved by these glaciers. And we end up with these stunning cliffs that plunge directly into the lake. The lake itself is quite deep. It's about 550 feet deep. So we could call it a pond, we could call it a lake, or we could really call it a fjord, a freshwater fjord. So a fjord is this valley system that's been carved by glaciers. And you can see that image in the bottom right of the screen. You can kind of picture about 18,000 years ago, that last glacial maximum. So that's the time the ice was the thickest over Newfoundland. There would have been about 1.5 miles of ice sitting over Newfoundland and flowing out towards the coast. And you can imagine the ice flowing from the bottom right of the screen, flowing up the valley towards the coast. And as this ice melted and began to retreat about 10 to 8,000 years ago, it left these empty valleys, these deep, deep valleys carved by the ice. And as it left these empty valleys, the ocean rushed in to fill these valleys with water. And that's how we get Western Brook Pond. So you might be thinking, if the ocean has filled up this system, has filled up this valley, why do we have this freshwater lake? Why do we call it Western Brook Pond? So it's actually really quite an interesting impact of glaciation. If you've had a chance to travel around the Canadian Arctic or Svalbard or really a lot of these Arctic areas, you typically can see examples of this on the land. Without vegetation, we can see a lot better examples of the impact of glaciation. And we know this as isostatic rebound or glacial rebound. And you can think of it really quite simply that ice and water is quite heavy. And as it's sitting on the crust of the earth, it is physically pushing the Earth's crust down. And as that ice melts, as we remove that weight, as those glaciers melt and retreat, the crust begins to rise and rebound back to its original state. So it's obviously a little bit more complex. You can see in the image there, some areas are rising, some are falling. The ice is moving back and forth. It's not a simple process. But we can think of the ground in a lot of areas as starting to rebound. And we see this in the Arctic quite a lot. I've included an image here from the Gros Morne coastline, where we can kind of see the impact of that in what we call raised beaches. So it looks like dunes behind, but what's happening is the land is rising, stabilizing, and a beach will form up, and then the land will rise again, and we'll get this procession of raised beaches. And like I said, you can see that really apparently in a lot of the Canadian Arctic, or even if you've had a chance to visit the Churchill area, you can see that really quite well. So with respect to Western Brook Pond, after the ocean filled up that valley, the land continued to rise and rise and rise, and eventually the pond became more and more isolated from the ocean and eventually completely cut off. And over time, that water became more of a freshwater system, and we're left with that beautiful, fresh, still low nutrient Western Brook Pond that we have, and really one of the most beautiful areas of the park. In the southwest corner of the park sits an area called the Tablelands. So on the map there, it's that area in orange. The Tablelands are really probably the other main attraction of the park. They're one of the most well-visited sites, and they're absolutely fascinating. You can see that image there. It looks like an otherworldly place, right? These hills are a completely different rock than any of the surrounding areas, and this rock is the rock that's usually only found in the mantle of the earth. There's actually 4 sites across Newfoundland that express the same geology, and Tablelands luckily is included in Gros Morne Park, and it's incredibly accessible compared to the other ones, and we really get a really great opportunity to go visit that site. So this is about 450 million year old rock. This massive rock was shifted from the mantle beneath an ancient sea to its current position during one of those continental collision events. The rock's quite unstable at the surface, and it breaks down and it forms these really unusual soils. And soil samples from the Tablelands have actually been used to test rover technology and simulate Martian environments. So as parts of the efforts to prepare rovers like Curiosity to explore on Mars. So the soil lacks some of those usual nutrients required to sustain most plant life. It's got quite a toxic quality, hence that really barren appearance. It's high in iron, so it gets that really rust-like appearance as well. And this is why we get carnivorous plants. So in that bottom right of the slide there, you can see the carnivorous purple pitcher plant, which is also the provincial flower of Newfoundland and Labrador. And so those carnivorous plants are getting nutrients from insects instead of from the soil. So researchers pictured there have even discovered methane in some of these rocks in the Tablelands. And given the fact that methane is produced on Mars, the next step involves questioning how this methane is being produced and what that might potentially mean for life outside of Earth. So there's a lot of amazing research going on within the Tablelands. And like I said, it's just one of those areas that's so accessible for a lot of these geologists that it's just really become this mecca for a lot of researchers to go up to Gros Morne to study some of these areas. With respect to us, when we get to visit Gros Morne, there's a lot of really great trails within the Tablelands. So within the Tablelands, they built a number of boardwalks because it can be quite tricky walking over some of those rocky areas. So you can take a boardwalk out and you can actually step off the boardwalk and step onto the mantle. Or for the more adventurous, you can actually head up into the highlands behind the Tablelands there. But it's one of those few times, maybe your only time ever, that you actually get to walk on the mantle of the earth, which is pretty amazing. So let's take a chance to talk about some of the recreation opportunities within the park. If you're visiting with Nat Hab, if you're visiting on your own, it's great to know it's a really, really wonderful park to explore. There's over 100 kilometers of hiking trails. So from half-hour strolls, like I was saying, on nice boardwalks to really strenuous multi-day hikes and some of the best wilderness trails in Canada. The long-range mountain traverse, really, really well-known wilderness backcountry trail that travels here from this area. So this is looking at the end of Western Brook Pond. So these people have taken a boat to the end and hiked up, and they've gotten lucky with that really wonderful viewpoint, and the weather's cooperated. From there, you can hike another 25 miles or 40 kilometers and come out on the other side near Gros Morne mountain itself. So there's a lot of trails within the park. And Matty Mitchell, who's a famous Micmac guide who lived in Norris Point, which is right in the park there, was quoted as saying, "When I walk, my legs do the thinking." And it's true that hiking is really one of the best ways to get to experience Gros Morne, whether it's in the mountains or along the coast or just strolling through one of the beautiful communities. We've seen some imagery as well just regarding boat-based tours, and there's a lot of marine-based activities that you can do as well. So there's whale watching activities. You can take those tours down Western Brook Pond all the way to the far end. You can also do kayaking and stand-up paddleboarding. So there's a lot of tourism operators that have started offering a lot of different opportunities for folks that are visiting. And it is a really easy, accessible place. There's an airport nearby. And it's really quite easy to get up to Gros Morne on your own. So if you're looking at self-guided, or there's opportunities for guided hiking and full kind of catered trips as well. So it's incredibly accessible. There's a lot of great accessible camping throughout the park as well. We talked about some of that wildlife that we can see and great bird watching as well. And then there's also that bonus. There's some really beautiful historic sites nearby. So we can drive up to the northern part of Newfoundland and visit that site where the Vikings first came across, that first contact site, or we can go just outside the park itself at Port au Choix. That's, if you recall, that's where we have that human history dating back about 4,500 years. So there's a huge amount of opportunities for recreation within the park itself. So before we want to wrap up, I did mention that I wanted to talk about some of the ongoing conservation efforts in the park, and also talk a little bit about this moose management program. So we mentioned moose were introduced to Newfoundland over 100 years ago now, and in the absence of those predators, with that abundant food supply, their numbers really increased rapidly, and they're what we know of now as a hyperabundant species. In almost an ironic string of events, once the park was established in 1973, hunting was fully prohibited within the park. So in addition to this, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were a number of defoliating insect events, and this really allowed an abundance of young trees and shrubs to take over. And the park became this haven for moose, where they were free from hunting and had abundance of vegetation. And like I mentioned, we had 7,800 moose by the late 1990s. So I'm sure some of you did the math. That's about 4 moose per square kilometer. And that's a lot more moose than the habitat could handle. So the damage caused by these moose reached these critical levels. It led to a failure in the forest to regenerate, and we get left with what we know of as these moose meadows, these kind of savanna-like areas. So you can see moose there. They really like to browse on the shoots of conifer trees or take the bark off a lot of trees as well, and it kills the trees basically, especially when they're being overbrowsed. And we end up with these areas that can't regenerate naturally on their own, and we know them as moose meadows. So we can look at what this enclosure looks like. This is a moose enclosure on Baker's Brook Falls Trail. And wow, you can really see the significant impact. So a single moose can actually eat 40 pounds or 18 kilograms of plant material each day. And that greatly outpaces the forest's ability to grow. So a lot of this regenerating forest is that young balsam fir that would have just been stripped clean by the moose. So that's, like I mentioned, led to the conversion from a lot of this forest that we can see into a lot of that really sparse forest and a lot of those moose meadows. So today, the park manages moose at a sustainable level, and these forests are starting to recover with benefits, obviously, to a lot of other species. So how is the park managing this moose population? Well, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the first couple of slides. They're working really quite closely with the local community. So Gros Morne has now been included in one of the moose management areas across Newfoundland, and Parks Canada initiated this moose management program in about 2011. And through this program, residents of Newfoundland and Labrador can apply for a permit to harvest moose within the park, and they're trying to manage the population at about 2,000 individuals, which should be few enough animals to allow the forest to regenerate naturally. And 2024, 2025, we had about 500 licenses for residents of the province, as well as for about 75 licenses for nonprofits as well. Moose is the only species you're allowed to harvest in the park, and really it's quite a unique situation in the fact that very few species are allowed to be harvested in any national parks across all of Canada. If you're looking at the map there and you're wondering some of the dates and closure areas, a lot of those dates and areas are just to avoid conflict with other parks users. So to avoid conflict with any of those tourism spots or hiking trails or places like that. And this moose management plan has been really quite successful, but we're still seeing areas in the backcountry, areas that are a little bit harder to access for hunters and things like that, still having a bit of a lack of regeneration within the forest. So there's hope to expand this program to hopefully start targeting some of those areas that are harder for humans to access and have been impacted by moose quite drastically. So I just want to wrap up here. We got a couple slides left. We'll talk about what the future of the park is going to look like, but this has also been a theme, hopefully, that we've been starting to think about as we've been learning about Gros Morne, because national parks can sometimes cause a lot of tension in local communities, especially communities that are based on resource extraction or resource-based communities like fishing and logging and things like that. So it's a really great example of how a park can work for the community and also work to protect the natural environment. And we mentioned even the initial founding of the park allowed those community members to really have that time to transition away from those resource-based economies to tourism and to see the benefits of having tourism as a year-round benefit to their economy. And now the national park is really quite a big deal in the area, and it's a really big draw for people. And it is this unique model, and a really perfect example of this is that we have this continued ability to harvest wood within the park for community members. So there's a lot of restrictions on this, like which tree species we can and can't harvest and how we can actually use that wood. So for example, the wood needs to be used for heating, repairing, constructing a small dwelling or a shed. So it needs to be used locally. It can't be for any commercial purposes at all. And it allows those community members to still retain those traditional lifestyles, to still be able to heat their homes with wood cutting in the forest, and also allow the park to protect the natural environment as well. So it's a really, really great example. And it's hopefully an example that we can see more national parks transitioning to around the world as well. So what does the future of Gros Morne look like? So it's already quite a large park that we've talked about, and Parks Canada is hoping to expand the park. So this is just really quite recent. National park boundaries may be expanded for multiple reasons, so including local interest, desire for more protection, or underrepresentation of natural regions in the national park system. And Parks Canada is currently in talks with some of these local communities a little bit further north out of the national park area right now. But there has been some worry expressed by some of these community members that the park might still threaten some of those traditional lifestyles, those traditional economies. So even with this model that we have, knowing that we can work together, there's still that fear, and it's a real fear that the national park could limit some of those activities that community members are used to in some of their traditional lives. So it's been preliminary discussions, and it'll be interesting to see in the next couple of years if the park continues to expand. The park is also continuing to focus on forest restoration, and it's thought that about as much as 40 square kilometers of the forest have been lost to moose browsing mostly, and might not be able to regenerate without a helping hand. So to help the forest return from these moose meadows, a new phase of forest restoration has begun. And in consultation with forestry experts across Canada, the forest health team at Gros Morne has embarked on a project to replant some of the worst affected areas of the park. And this forest restoration initiative really helps to restore ecological integrity across the entire park and through all the ecosystems, and really rebuild that healthy and resilient ecosystem within the park itself to support a lot of those really unique wildlife populations. So we're getting to the end. We'll kind of wrap it up here, guys. I can't see anyone, but I feel like I can read your minds. You're probably thinking, wow, Gros Morne seems like an amazing spot. I want to go visit. And I bet your main question is, how can I visit with NatHab, and how can I visit with my favorite expedition leaders? Well, you're in luck. So starting just in June of this year, we're launching that new itinerary. It's a 12-day itinerary to Newfoundland and Labrador. Check out the website. I won't take too much time talking about it now because we're focusing on Gros Morne Park. We can address that in some of the questions if that comes up as well. But check out the website. We're also going to be doing a Know Before You Go webinar sometime in the middle of June. So look for that. But just know it's a really beautiful spot. We'll get to spend a number of days in the park there. So you can see the image on the top right. That's Gros Morne Inn. A really beautiful, nice locally owned spot just within the park boundaries that we get to spend some time at. And you can kind of see the itinerary there as well. So just know that it's a really beautiful trip, a really beautiful opportunity to explore Gros Morne. So thank you guys for taking the time to be with me here today and learn a little bit more about the park and learn about this special place in Canada. And hopefully we've got some questions and then we can have some final thoughts as well. So thanks, Rob.
All right, Anthony, thank you so much. Now, before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. Go to the upper right-hand corner. You see those 3 lines there, the hamburger they call it. Click on those, and if you scroll down, you'll see the question tab. Go ahead and submit your questions right in there. All right, so let's get to some questions. Was Newfoundland a separate country from Canada 75 years ago?
So there's a lot of history there that we can dive into. But Newfoundland was really the last to join Canada, so about 76 years ago now. And some of that history is really quite complex and quite interesting. The history of French settlement and of English settlement within the province and within the country itself. But I feel like that's best suited to a much longer conversation, hopefully that we can have on the trip itself.
So I know you want to hold off, but did it belong to someplace else before?
It was its own entity, so it wasn't part of Canada at all. The Dominion of Newfoundland. And I don't know the full history now, so I don't want to dive into and provide any wrong details. So I'll leave it at that for now, Rob.
Perfect. Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate that. So is it possible that animals could have reached Newfoundland by swimming or walking across the ice, things like that?
Definitely, yeah. And so there's a narrow body of water between Newfoundland and Labrador that actually still freezes up seasonally. So it's very possible that animals are able to move between the island. And I don't know if anyone's following, just a couple of weeks ago, we actually had a polar bear quite far south down on Newfoundland, and it came across on some of the ice floes as well. So we do get animals arriving on the island. There's always whispers of maybe wolverine on the island as well. So there's animals that could be there. There's animals that could be moving back and forth. But in terms of breeding populations of animals, it's always been really restricted to about those 14 mammal species. And now obviously other animals that have been introduced to the area as well.
So what predators were historically in the park? And is there any consideration to bringing them back to help control the moose numbers?
Yeah, good question. So historically within the park, we can think of smaller predators. So there's lynx within the park, quite rare. We don't have any of those other cats like cougars and things like that, but we do have lynx. We have black bear. There's no evidence of grizzly bear being on the island. And there's not really a discussion of reintroducing predators to control the moose population. I think the idea now is that moose have been introduced, and now how can we manage that? And I think it's the same with a lot of invasive species across the world is using different strategies to try and manage that population without introducing more animal species. Even if those animals maybe were traditionally in that area in the far distant past, at least not within human history, there's been no large predators within the park. So I don't think the discussion is there yet to introduce some of these animals, more to use the tools that we have and really try to start managing that population of moose, because you're right, it has been really quite detrimental. And like I said, we get those ironic situations where we have this park that's supposed to be protecting the wildlife, protecting the ecosystems. We can't hunt the moose in the park and the moose are exploding. So it's been interesting to see in the last decade how successful this program has been, from calling the moose from about 8,000 to 2,000 and the impacts that's having. But with respect to introducing other species, I think the discussion isn't there yet.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. So, are there other insects or aquatic invertebrates observed in the freshwater lakes?
So a lot of the freshwater, like I mentioned, they're quite low nutrient lakes. So there's great fishing in the lakes, but we don't see um, like an abundance of a large abundance of insects or marine or freshwater invertebrates. They're there, but they're not as commonly seen. A lot of these lakes are quite low nutrient just due to the geology of the area as well. Um, yeah.
So, are there fish in the lakes? If we wanted to fish, is that something that you could do there?
Definitely, yeah. So a lot of great fishing opportunities. I'm throwing back to I won't go through the slides; it gets too confusing. But throwing back to some of the historical images that we had, there's been freshwater fishing starting all the way back in the 1800s there. So really great opportunities for that, and I know there's some guided options and some self-guided options as well.
Great, thank you. So, what about orchids? Are there any native orchids that exist in the park?
That is a very great question. And I don't want to speak out of turn. I'm not super familiar with the orchid species in the park, so I don't have a good answer for you there. I'm really sorry.
Not to worry, sir, not to worry. So, we know that NatHab is going to start running their trips in June. Would you say that that's the best time of year to go there? Or what is the best time of year to visit?
Yeah, so always such a tricky question, right? And NatHab, we're always trying to choose the best time for all our trips. So it's quite a short season that we're offering this new itinerary. So this year we're only running 5 trips. They run from late June, so starting June 22nd until the middle of August, and just a huge variety between the trips, right? It's always such a wonderful time to visit in terms of wildlife, in terms of the scenery as well, coming a little bit earlier. So this photo here was taken end of May. There's still a little bit of snowpack on the hills, which is always really great. The waterfalls are flowing quite nicely, but by August you get those a little bit warmer temperatures, things like that. With respect to movement of wildlife and things like that, all times are great to come during the summer there. If you're coming with NatHab, those are great times if you're wanting to visit on your own. Just be cautious in the winter months and in those shoulder seasons. It can be really hit or miss. My wife and I got really lucky here in May. It was just absolutely beautiful weather, and my family went the following May, and it was frozen seas and negative temperatures. So it can be really hit or miss in those shoulder seasons. Still super beautiful, but really those summer months, late June, July, August are really that peak time that you want to be visiting the park,
And
unless you're
in
really
that,
into winter sports.
so in that peak time, can you talk about what the range of temperatures that we're going to face?
Definitely, it can get quite chilly, right? So we are in that. We mentioned that Labrador current coming down that impacts that northern part of Newfoundland itself. So it can get quite chilly, but we're talking about pretty mild summer temperatures, right? So we're on the coast, and if we expand a little bit to look at the entire Newfoundland Labrador itinerary, a lot of those activities are boat-based activities. So we're spending a lot of time on zodiacs. We're going whale watching. We're visiting some amazing puffin colonies. We're hiking along that coastline there. So even on the warmer days, as always, like when we're on boats and things like that or along the coast, we're going to want to be bundled up. And I'm trying to convert in my head Celsius and Fahrenheit. We're usually looking low 20s kind of thing in during the days and getting a little bit colder in the evenings. But always that risk of wind chill and always that risk of kind of weather changing quite rapidly. And like I mentioned, we'll dive more into how to be prepared, how we want to prepare for the trip. We'll do one of those know before you go webinars, and if you haven't seen those, they're really quite useful if you're preparing for the trip on your own or with NatHab.
Are there a lot of black flies and mosquitoes to contend with?
So again, as with anywhere, right? We're in these wilderness areas. There are a lot of those freshwater lakes, a lot of freshwater in the area. But again, and this is my personal experience, right? When we're on the coast, when we're on those boats, there's a lot of wind movement, and it typically keeps those insects at bay. And it's not something living out on the East Coast that I've struggled with at all. Yeah. So if you've been up to northern Canada, like the Arctic in July or something, and dealt with those mosquitoes up there, it's quite different than coming to Newfoundland and Labrador.
Great to know that. Thank you. So are when we're coming up there to stay, are there camping facilities in the park, or what kind of lodging are we going to have, whether we're coming on our own or with
Yep,
the NatHab trip?
definitely. Yeah, so there's a huge amount of opportunities. So there's really great accessible camping. There's backcountry camping if we want to talk about that. But in terms of front country camping, there's a lot of really, really great spots within the park, and then private camping opportunities that have set up just outside the park boundaries. And we're talking about oceanfront, like beautiful views, beautiful camping. It's a national park. We draw a number of visitors up there, but it stays pretty quiet, right? It's a large area with a lot of communities to explore. So there's never these huge rushes. So there's really great camping opportunities. And then, like I mentioned, it has been this really amazing impact for these communities. So a lot of community members have taken upon themselves to start up bed and breakfast. We still get these really beautiful classic bed and breakfast, Airbnb, and some of these new organizations have set up there as well. So we get Airbnbs. There's a huge variety of options, a really great opportunities. That place we stay at the Gros Morne is a really beautiful spot just outside the park. So there's a really great opportunity, and it is a really accessible place to get a chance to go visit.
Great, thank you. So, with the NatHab trip, are we going to be camping in the park, or are we staying in hotels?
So unfortunately, we're not camping in the park. We do get quite deep in the park, so we do have the opportunity to do a private boat tour on Western Brook Pond. So that's still in the image there. We do a little stroll out there. It's about 3 kilometers along a boardwalk, and then we do get all the way to the back of the lake, and then we do get to explore in the Tablelands area as well, and out by that Trout River along the ocean front as well. But we'll be staying in a little bit more luxury than tents. We'll be at that Gros Morne. It's a new spot they set up there, and it's got some really nice comforts for us as well.
Do you visit the Viking settlement on the north end?
Unfortunately, not. So we've spent a lot of time planning this itinerary, and it's really difficult to get up there with the amount of time that we have on the trip. So we do visit the Port au Choix site, we visit the L'Assommoir site, and we visit some really historic sites like Red Bay up in Labrador, and we get out to Battle Harbor, but we don't get up to the Viking settlement site up at St. Anthony's.
Gotcha, thank you. So, if I wanted to spend some extra time in the park, either before or after the NatHab trip, is there a best time to come to avoid crowds?
Like I said, it's if I was going to the park, and especially during the summer months like we talked about, I would book some of the activities in advance. So like if you want to go out on that boat tour with Bond Tours, you can look at some of those in advance because some of those fill up. But in terms of big crowds and big people, just walking some of those coastal trails, or just if you have the ability, getting a little bit further off on the trail, you'll find yourself pretty alone in the park. And with respect to some of the backcountry options, Parks Canada does a really great job at limiting the amount of people that can actually be out during the day. So that long range traverse, if you're a bigger hiker, you want to do that. That's a permit of only 3 permits a day that get given out there. So you'll find yourself, if you poke around a little bit, you can find a lot of solitude within the park, even during those peak summer months.
Great, thank you. So, Anthony, I assume you'll be leading the trip out there. Is there anything in particular that you're looking forward to showing us when we come out and visit you?
Definitely. Great question. Thank you for that. Yeah. So I am leading 3 of the trips out there. We also have 2 wonderful expedition leaders, Judy and Miranda. If you've been up to Churchill, you might have been on one of their trips as well. So they're both leading some trips out there as well. And to be honest, it's such a beautiful place, exploring the entire island, starting where we do down in St. John's, getting down to Witless Bay and exploring some of those areas, getting to visit the largest puffin colony in North America. But I'm really excited. I have had a chance to explore Labrador and gotten to Red Bay and some of those historic spots, but I've never had a chance to get out to Battle Harbor. And we're going to spend 3 nights out at Battle Harbor. It's going to be a really beautiful spot. It's kind of known as the historic capital of Labrador. And we have the opportunity there for hiking, for walking around. And it's a really similar landscape that we get to the Gros Morne landscape. It's that subarctic those kind of barren grounds. And it's going to be a really exciting place. And then coming back and wrapping up the trip at Gros Morne will just be super exciting. So I'm really excited to share really the entire itinerary, but really coming back to the park and seeing some of these spots that we can see on the screen. They're a lot more beautiful in person. So getting back to Western Brook Pond and getting to hike around the Tablelands is always pretty special.
All right, great.
Yeah, thanks for
Thanks for sharing that. We do appreciate it. Unfortunately, that is going to be all the time that we do have for questions today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for any closing comments you have.
Perfect. Thanks, Rob. I just all I have to say is really thank you to everyone for coming out to listen to me talk about Gros Morne. It might not have been a park that anyone's heard about. Maybe it's on your radar, and I'd love to come, or I'd love to have you guys come visit us this summer or next summer. I think it's going to be a really beautiful trip. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us, and thank you, Rob. And we'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll see you guys again for another Daily Dose.
Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can email us at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.